Hello everyone and welcome once again to Automation Recipes. My name is Vinicius Maidana and this is our second part of the web automation series. In the first part, we talked about basic concepts of web automation using IBM RPA. We also went a little bit into how the web automation recorder works. In this session, we're actually going to build a web automation. We're going to automate a task in a web application, in a web page. And as we go along, I'm going to give you guys some tips and tricks on how to deal with web automation, as well as teach you how to automate a web application in general. So, as you may notice, on this script you're looking at right here, we already have some commands defined. We have some variable definition, and we have the get vault item command, which is the command that we use to get credentials from the IBM RPA vault. That's another topic for another day. And then we have the start browser command with a navigate command right after it, and then the close browser command. You may remember that the start browser and the close browser command, everything between those two, that's the web automation context. So basically, this navigate command is navigating to a web application called Orange HRM. It's basically a human resources management system based on the web. So if we run this bot right now, I'm going to run it without debugging. We can see that the bot opens the browser and navigates to the Orange HRM page. Now, so far so good. Now the first thing we can see here is that we need to insert a username and a password here. We already got this username on our bot. We got that from the vault with the get vault item commands, and both the username and the password are already safely stored here in these two variables that we defined right at the beginning of the script. One of them being, of course, the password variable, which is a secure string variable, in which the password that you get from the credential vault is encrypted so that you can use that information in a secure way. Nobody can see this variable, because even if you're trying to write it on a text form, it's basically going to come out as an encrypted text. So this variable is specifically meant to be used with password fields. Okay, so let's start dealing with this login page here. Now you may remember that the last time we used the web automation recorder to build some basic automation, something really basic, some clicks here, some navigation. We're going to go into the web recorder soon. But first, I want to teach you another method of dealing with web automation. And that is by inspecting elements and using the page's code, the page's HTML that is, to identify the elements that you want the bot to interact with. And how do you do that? Well, basically every browser has an inspector in which you can inspect the backend of the pages you are accessing. In this case, for instance, I'm using Chrome here. If I just right-click on any element and hit the inspect button, we can see the inspector has opened up here. And as we hover our mouse over these elements, over this backend HTML, we can see that the browser is highlighting to us what element this specific HTML snippet is correspondent to. In this case, we inspected the password field, so we can inspect it again, and we can see that this password field is highlighted here in the inspector. Here we can see some information like the field's name, the field's ID, the type of field, and everything about this specific element here. Now, how can we use this backend to identify the element, to have the bot identify this element when it tries to automate the code? It's basically very simple. There are multiple ways to do it. I'm going to show you multiple ways to do it, but we're going to start with the most basic and easiest one first, which is to use the element's ID, which is this ID here, as an input parameter for the web set command. So let's just first copy this. We're going to copy this ID. We're going to go back to the IBM RPA studio. We're going to look for the web set command. which is also known as set value to field. We're going to drag this command right after the navigate command right here. And here is the configuration window for this command. Now all we need to do is paste that ID right here. And that is it. The bot can already identify the element we wanted to identify. All we need to do now is to actually insert a value here to be inserted, to be set to that password field that we saw before. And we're going to do that by using the variable that we set up before as the password. So we're going to select the variable here, and we're going to save this command. And that is pretty much all you need to do. Now you may notice that there are some other parameters here on the set value command. And here's my first tip to you guys. The simulate human parameter, you can see it right here. And you may be wondering, okay, so how do I use this parameter? When do I use this parameter? Well, basically, it really depends on the kind of element that you're interacting with. Now, most of the time, you don't really need to use the simulate human parameter, because when you don't use it, the bot's going to just inject the value that you wanted to inject directly onto the element. Normally that works just fine, and it is faster. But sometimes, depending on the kind of field that you're manipulating, you have to use the simulate human parameter. And basically what this parameter does is, instead of the bot just injecting the value there, as if it's pasting it onto the field, it's going to simulate a human typing that value onto the field. So instead of just injecting the value, it's going to simulate a human typing the value there. Some kinds of fields in web applications have some sort of validation that they don't allow a value to just be pasted onto the field. It's really common, especially with password fields in many web applications and many web pages. Now, it really depends on how the web application was developed. Just like with Windows automation, there's a lot of variability, and you have to adapt your automation to how the application you're trying to automate was developed. So if you noticed that just not using the simulate human parameter and just injecting the value directly onto the field is not working out, is giving you errors, try using the simulate human parameter so that the bot simulates this typing, and then you can see during the automation that the bot is actually going to type the value. And that normally solves the problem with the validation of the field not allowing information to be just pasted, to be just injected into that element, right? For the password field specifically here, we are going to leave the simulate human parameter on. I want to show you guys how this works. And I want you to see the difference between using it and not using it. So I'm going to save this right now. Now I'm just going to go ahead and Control C, then Control V. Just copy this command and just paste it right here. So we have another set value command right here. We're going to go back to the web page that we were automating before. And we're going to actually, now we're going to inspect the username field. As you can see, it's already popping up here. You can inspect elements in multiple ways. It really depends on the browser as well. You can just right click on the element and press inspect. Here on Chrome, you can also use this little arrow here, which is the element selector here, and just choose the element you want and then left click it. And it has the exact same effect as right clicking and then pressing inspect. But the difference is that using this element selector here, you can actually see the elements being highlighted as you hover them. So you are absolutely sure that you are trying to inspect the correct element. Depending on the kind of element you're trying to find, you're trying to automate, it is more reliable. Now, basically here what we're going to do is the exact same thing. We're going to copy the ID for this field, and now we're going to paste that ID on this other set value command that we pasted here. So now it's text username, and here we're also going to change this variable. This is no longer the password. This is now the username. So we just save this. Oh, and by the way, I forgot about this. We're also going to turn off, we're going to disable the simulate human parameter, because I want you guys to see the difference between using it or not. So this one, I'm going to save it without the simulate human parameter. And the last thing we need to do now before we actually log in is actually pressing the login button after putting the information here. So we're going to inspect this, and we're going to do something a little bit different with the login button. Now, as you may notice, this button also has an ID right here. You can see the ID right here, btn login, button login. We could use this ID just fine to automate this, this part of the process. We could just use the ID to identify this element right here. But I want you to show you guys another method that you can use. Now, one other method that you can use to identify an element is to use the element's CSS to identify it. Well, how can you do that? Well, basically, we're hovering the HTML for this element right here, right? All you need to do is right-click on this, copy, and then copy selector. You're going to copy this selector. Now we're going to go to the IBM RPA Studio. We're going to search for the web click command, also known as click on web page. We're going to drag it all the way down here after we inserted the information in the fields. Now we're going to change the selector here. We're going to search for CSS this time, and we're going to paste that here. Now, as you can see, it is very similar to the ID that we had before. Only this is the CSS for that element. Not always the CSS is so similar to the ID like it is here. But this whole web application is very well organized. It's really clean and simple on its back end. So it is really simple to identify any element here, even using their IDs. We really wouldn't need to use the CSS here, but using the CSS can be useful in multiple situations, especially when an element does not have an ID, and that is extremely likely. It is more common than you think for elements to not have IDs attached to them. Again, it also depends on how the application was developed as a whole, like always, right? So basically here, what you want to do is, if you have access to an ID, if the ID of the element is simple and easy to use, it's right here, you know, you can find it real fast, and it's a unique ID, you should prefer using that. The ID is normally the fastest way to identify an element. It's not the only one, but it is normally the fastest, especially when the IDs are unique. But if you don't have an ID, or if the ID is not unique, then you can use the CSS. That is definitely going to help you out to identify elements that do not have IDs. So again, just to remember, right-click on the HTML snippet that is correspondent to the element you're trying to automate, copy, and then copy selector. And then just whatever you copy from here, you just have to paste it here on the command. You have to choose CSS. This is important. Choose CSS, and then paste it here. And that's it. Now, as you can see here on click on web page, we also have other parameters like double click. We don't need to do that right now. No wait, we also don't have to worry about that now. The simulate human command is really similar to how it works on set value to field. Basically, instead of just injecting the page with information, to click on the button, the bot will simulate a human driving the mouse to the element and then clicking on that element using the mouse left click. We don't really need this again right now, so I'm just going to save this. So now we're going to run this bot. Let me just close this browser first. So now we're going to run this bot and see how it works. See if the bot manages to identify all the elements and insert all the information we want, and also click on the button we want it to click. So the bot's going to, once again, open the browser, navigate to that page, insert the information, and click on the login button. Now, that may have happened really fast, and you may have not seen the difference, but you may have noticed that the username was inserted right then and there, instantly, while the password was typed out. if we insert, and I just want to demonstrate this to you so it's clear as day, I'm going to insert a little delay here between one set value and another. I'm just going to set this as 2 seconds, which is more than enough for us to see the difference. And I'm going to run this again. This time I won't run on debugging because then it's a lot faster. So you see right there, the username is inserted instantly as if the bot pasted it there. It's injected the information straight onto the field. The password field was typed out as if it's simulating a human user typing the password here. It's still fast, but it's not as fast as just injecting the information directly onto the field. So keep that in mind. Simulate human can be very useful for circumventing some specifics on certain pages. How they work, how they are validated, how the fields are validated. But as fast as it is, it can sum up. So if you use simulate human on every single time you need to set a value to a field, that little time difference between just injecting the element with the information and typing out the information, simulating the typing, that's going to sum up and make your automation slower. So for efficiency's sakes, try not to use simulate human as much as you can. If you notice that you have to, that's not a problem. That's absolutely fine. Just try to avoid it as much as you can so you can have your automation be as fast and efficient as possible. That's another tip for you. Now, from here on out, what we're going to do is we're going to insert a new employee, a new user into the system, right? Now, first you need to know how to navigate this application, right? And that goes for any application you try to automate. You need to know how to navigate it. You need to know where to go, right? And the most efficient path to go where you need to go. To add an employee, basically we have to hover here at the PIM option. This is going to enable this menu here. And then we need to click on Add Employee. And this is going to lead us to this page right here, which is the Add Employee page, where we have to insert the first name, the last name. Employee ID is generated automatically, so we don't need to worry about that. We could also insert a photograph here, and that is extremely possible with IBM RPA. We're not going to do that right now. So basically that's all we need to do, and just hit save. And from then on, we can move on to perform other tasks after the employee is already registered. Okay, so first of all, like I mentioned, we need to hover our mouse. We need to focus on the PIM option here so we can enable the Add Employee option. So how do we do that? There's a command specifically for focusing on an element on a web page or a web application in general. And that command is called Focus on Web Element. Now, name is pretty self-explanatory when you think about it. And basically, we're going to use this command right here to focus on the PIM option here on the page. So we can enable the Add Employee option. And from there, we can click on the Add Employee option to come here to this Add Employee page. So let's try doing that. What we need to do first, of course, is inspect the PIM option there in the menu. So let's inspect this element right here. Okay, so we see here that we have the element is here. Now, let me look for this a little better. What I want, actually, yeah, there we go. What I want is this this snippet here. This is the text that's inside the button, which is a link, actually. What I actually want is this element right here. So I don't want the text. I want this right here, the actual button that is, well, as a matter of fact, it's a link. So, again, as we can see, there is an ID here that we can use just fine. This ID would work perfectly fine to find this element and focus on it. But we're going to do something different again. Now, the last time we used the the CSS, which is the selector from here, from copy and selector. This time, let's use another kind of identifier to enable this element right here. And we're going to use the full XPath. Now, the XPath is it's the XML path to this specific element on the entire page. So let's try using that. We're going to drag the focus on web element right here after the click on web page command. And we're going to choose XPath here and paste that XPath that we copied with the inspector right here. This should be enough to identify that element. Now, that should be enough, but there are some things that I want to discuss before we continue. And that is something that we already discussed previously, actually. And you may notice that it is missing from my code. If you are paying attention, on our last session, I mentioned that it is good practice to use the web wait command, which is the wait for element in a web page command. Now, you may remember that I told you guys that it is good practice to use this command before the first click on every new web page we navigate to. Let me iterate that with another piece of info. It is good practice not to use it only before the first new click on every new page. It is good practice to do that before every new interaction with any element in a new page. Now, you may notice that I didn't really use it here on our first interaction, right? I didn't use it on any of these set value to field commands. Before the set value to field commands. I didn't use it on the click on web page commands. I didn't use it anywhere here. Now, that worked out for me just fine because this page, as I mentioned before, it's very clean. This whole system, this whole web application is very clean and it's very simple and it loads really, really fast. But that's not always the case. So if you are not using the web wait command, the wait for element in a web page command, before the first interaction with any element in a web page, and you're not having any problems, count yourself lucky. Of course, it also depends on a number of other factors. So, for instance, you are developing a bot that is a web automation bot. You are developing that, and you notice that everything is going smoothly. You don't really have to use the wait for element in a web page command. Everything is going fine. But you may have to remember this. The production environment is not always the same as the development environment. Now, you're developing the bot on your machine, and it's just fine. On your machine, on your workstation, on wherever it is that you're developing your bot and you're using IBM RPA Studio, the connection is fast, the performance is pretty good. But maybe when this bot goes into the production environment, it's going to be another machine, it's going to be another station, it's going to be another computer. And the connection on that computer may be very different. It may be a lot slower than in yours. The hardware, the performance on that machine may also differ greatly. They may also be a lot slower than your own machine. So you need to take that into consideration. Which is why, again, it is good practice to use it regardless of whether you need to use it or not on your development machine. So here's a tip, another tip for you. Always use the wait for element in a web page command before the first interaction on every new web page. And I know I have repeated this a number of times now, but it is very important because, like I mentioned, while it may work without it on your machine, it might not work on the production machine. And then you're going to start running into problems that the bot's not being able to click somewhere, the bot's not being able to set the value to some input field here, it's not being able to capture the value on another field. That's because you're not waiting for the elements to fully load on the page before you're actually trying to interact with it. So when the bot tries to interact with the element, it's not loaded, the page is not fully loaded, and it's just going to miss the element because then the bot's going to just not find that element because it's not loaded yet. And your bot's going to fail because of that. Something that simple. So let's use that good practice technique here. I'm going to put the wait for element in a web page right here before the focus on web element, which is the first interaction on that new page. And I'm going to use the same identifier as before. I'm going to choose XPath here and paste it right here. And I'm also going to do that on the first set value to field right here. So I'm going to copy this identifier here, which is the ID. And I'm going to put the wait for element in a web page command here and use that ID to wait for the element. Now, the wait for element in a web page command, although you don't necessarily need to use a timeout, it is good practice to always use a specific timeout with this command, because then you can set a specific time for the bot to await for that element. Now, for instance, if I put 10 seconds here, the bot won't necessarily wait 10 seconds for that element. And just proceed after 10 seconds. The bot's going to wait up to 10 seconds for that element to show up. Now, if after 10 seconds the element still doesn't show up, the bot's just going to proceed to the next command. If it shows up before 10 seconds, then it's also going to proceed to the next command because the element has already been found. It doesn't need to wait anymore. So another very good use for this command is to actually use it as a validation method to identify whether an element has been identified, has been located or not. Because you can use the variable here, the output variable, which is the result variable. This is a Boolean variable. So if I use this variable right here, this is a Boolean variable. So I can use the result of this variable to build a validation for this element right here. So for instance, I could, and this is just an example, a very simple, almost banal example, but you could, for instance, surround the wait for element in the web page command with a while. So while that result is false, which is true, and negate that. So while this variables here, the Boolean here is false, it's just going to keep trying to locate the element until it finds it. It's going to just keep waiting for the element to show up. Again, this is just a very simple example. Not even a very good one, because of course this can lead you into an infinite loop with this while. But it is just an example to see what you can do. You can set up all sorts of validation structures using flow control structures like whiles, ifs, fors, to direct the flow of your web automation depending on the results of the wait for element in the web page command. So again, very simple example, not even a very good one, because again, this can lead you into an infinite loop, but this is just to spark that creativity in your head so you can have an idea on what you can do with the wait for element in the web page command for validation and for increasing your bot's resilience to failure. So if you can't find an element, what can you do? How do you treat that problem? Are you going to try to refresh the page? Are you going to try to navigate to another page? Or are you going to try to restart the whole process of you're going to go back and then just start navigating back to this page again? There are multiple ways to do it. There are infinite possibilities. This is just an example so you can have that little brain teaser in your head, just so you can think about the possibilities that can be done with this command and its result. Now I'm going to save this. This is not going to have any practical effects on our automation here specifically because, like I mentioned, we don't really need this wait for element in a web page command because this page loads very fast, but it is good practice to use it, so we're going to use it. I'm also going to set up a timeout on this other command, like I mentioned. Good practice to use a timeout, a specific timeout, with the wait for element in a web page command. The default timeout is 3 seconds. We could use the default timeout, but I'm just going to put here 10 seconds, just like on that previous wait for element in a web page command. And now we're going to click on the Add Employee button here that was enabled once we focused on the PIM option here. And again, business as usual, we're going to inspect this button. Okay, we already found it. This time, let's just use the ID. It's much more simple. We're going to go back here we're going to use another web click command right after the focus on web element. And we're going to use that ID right here and save. Now you notice that I never used simulate human on any of that. And you may be wondering, well, can you simulate this mouse hovering on an element and then have that enable another element for you to click on it without using simulate human? Well, let's check it out. I'm going to just run this bot without debugging. Actually, first let's close this browser and let's run this bot to see if it manages to navigate to the page we needed to. So once more, I'm going to open the orange HRM, insert the information, enable the PIM, and click on Add Employee. It's already there. See how fast that was? So yeah, it was pretty possible to simulate the hovering of the mouse to focus on this element and then clicking on the Add Employee option here on the menu. It all happened really fast. But again, this really depends on how the application was developed. So once more, I'm going to repeat it so it's perfectly clear how important this is. If you don't need to use the simulate human command, don't do it because it's going to be faster. But if you need to, in this case we didn't need to, but depending on how the page was built, depending on how this web application was developed, maybe you wouldn't have needed to do it. So just to make sure, don't use it. But if you need to, if you see that what you're trying to do, the mouse hovering to enable another element and then clicking on that button that was enabled with the mouse hovering, if that's not working for you, try using the simulate human parameter. We will be surprised at how much you can circumvent just by activating the simulate human parameter. So once more, it's absolutely fine to use it, but if you don't have to, then don't. So our next step is to actually register the employee here on this page. And for that, we are going to use the recorder because I want to show you guys more features for the recorder. However, that is going to be left for our next part in this series. So I hope you learned something on the second part. There's still more to cover on web automation that I want to talk to you guys about. I hope you are enjoying this so far. I hope you are enjoying the tips and tricks that I'm giving you guys. So on the next session, we're going to continue this automation process. And I'm going to show you more about the web recorder, some more features, and also going to give you more tips and tricks on how to deal with web automation and how to deal with unexpected things that may arise. So thank you for your attention, and I'll see you next time.